Hello, today was Cities, Regions and the Built Environment Day. I apologise to listeners, there is no interview today, which is particularly unfortunate now that I've finally worked out how to use the microphone. Trust me, listeners, it is as boring for me to talk to my laptop as it is for you to listen. But I will say it is worth bearing with me today because there was plenty of news for planners and all of it's very exciting. But before getting to the progress that was made today, and there was progress, eagle ear listeners will remember that I promised two things. First, to find out what concessional capital meant, and secondly, an Article 6 specific podcast. And I want to cover both off in this final substantive episode, as well as to source an unsourced comment that I made in the interview with the incredible Steph Ray on soil. And as a lawyer, stating anything without evidence is deeply, deeply troubling. So I have figured out where I got that quote from. That quote, for those who can't remember, when speaking with Steph, I mentioned having heard that if soil degradation isn't dealt with within the next 60 years, there is predicted to be a crisis in food production. I found out where I read that statistic, and it came from Maria Helena Semedo, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, of the Food and Agricultural Organization, who said back on World Soil Day that if current rates of degradation continue, all of the world's topsoil could be gone within 60 years. Now, on concessional capital, that means what it says: capital lended with concessions from considered against normal market terms, so a lower rate of interest, for example. No one, however, has been able to tell me the specific terms of the concessional capital that's been agreed, so those remain to be worked out. And finally, the Article 6 podcast is developing into a really exciting set of interviews, but those will take place once the dust is settled on COP26. Now, the theme all along and throughout COP26 has been accountability. We've had exciting pledges, wonderful sounding pledges, but pledge on its own doesn't result in anything. It does have value because, of course, it signals what the accepted norms are nowadays and signals to astute industries where the direction of travel is, so they can start aligning their strategies and activities and give themselves an early mover advantage and avoid having to pull out of investments down the line. But accountability is fundamental, and to that end today there was excellent news on the accountability front. And this is to supplement the earlier news of the establishment of the high-level expert group at the UN level, where scientists will develop accountability and transparency metrics regarding international net zero commitments. So further to that, Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor have presented today a global fossil fuel registry, which is an online tool that enables users to assess which nations are extracting which quantities of fossil fuels and whether their approaches are compatible with a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. So that too is going to help make governments more accountable for their plans. But also Carbon Tracker has said that they see the finance sector as one of the key user groups for the registry for the reasons I've mentioned earlier. Also on this topic, and also coming today, was an announcement by Denmark and Costa Rica that they have launched an initiative requiring nations to set an end date for new oil and gas licensing and to establish plans to phase out existing capacity. This alliance already includes Wales, France, Ireland, New Zealand, Sweden, Greenland, California, and Quebec. Turning to matters relating to the day's theme, the built environment, as I said, it was an important and very interesting day. Important because urban buildings account for 40% of global carbon emissions every year. And the built environment is the UK's second highest source of emissions. We have the oldest and draftiest housing stock, definitely in Europe and quite possibly the world. And the value chains of cities are attributable to 68% of all global annual greenhouse gas emissions, and these are UNFCCC estimates. The private sector over and over again reminded delegates that the government cannot just assume that it will innovate its way out of the climate crisis. The public sector is critical. And on this, it's really important to note what Jamie Peters reminded us of, which is that 60% of the UK public want the country to be a leader, so not just aligned with the direction of travel towards net zero set by other countries in the efforts to tackle climate change. That leadership position requires leadership, obviously, in the public sector, which brings us to the central role of planners. on Built Environment Day. Today, the RTPI reminded us that they published a planning post-COVID to coincide with COP26. This is to supplement their March 2021 report called Place-Based Approaches to Climate Change, and the third edition, dated October 2021, of the joint RTPI and Town and Country Planning Association report called The Climate Crisis, a Guide for Local Authorities on Planning for Climate Change. Both documents are excellent guides for local planning authorities, and I hope they reach a wide readership. Now, the RTPI's latest document, Urban Planning After COVID-19, has 6 recommended actions for local planning authorities relevant to climate change. These are, firstly, unlock the potential of the local development plan at the heart, which is the heart of local climate solutions. Local planning authorities are told to ensure that the community is at the heart of the process and that the plan is seen as a key corporate priority in responding to the climate crisis. Secondly, local planning authorities should understand the legal and policy obligations for action on climate change, including the UK's 6th carbon budget and how national targets apply to actions that can be controlled or influenced locally. That's very important. Thirdly, to ensure as local planning authorities that there is a comprehensive and relevant evidence on climate mitigation in the area, and that evidence sets local carbon reduction targets, ideally for the local development plan. There are existing online tools, and the RTPI has published a guide to those tools on the RTPI Learn platform. Fourthly, to apply that evidence to assess and then select policies that are consistent with achieving those carbon reduction targets. Fifthly, to use established assessment frameworks to monitor the effectiveness of policy and to engage partners such as universities and private consultancies to support the analysis of policy impacts, and I should say developers. And an annual reporting mechanism was also recommended by the RTPI. Sixthly, to ensure that whenever a decision is made contrary to plan policy, that the climate impacts of that decision are fully assessed. And the RTPI recommends that development is not approved if it would increase risk to the community or exceed established carbon budgets. So all very interesting and highly important recommendations from the RTPI there. There was also a report published to coincide with COP26 by the World Green Building Council. This is called Beyond the Business Case, and that starts from the business case to green the built environment, but then goes on to point out that the built environment does have an extensive time frame. We generally build for 70 years, and so fundamental changes to the built environment are going to be at the very heart of the net zero transition, given the longevity of what we are constructing today and planning for today. This means policymakers in the UK are absolutely going to have to put in place policy now to support that transition, just as the RTPI Urban Planning Post-COVID report recommends. And finally, the UK Green Building Council has published its Whole Life Carbon Roadmap, which is a tool to help businesses in the built environment sector measure and reduce carbon from their materials, processes, operation, and demolition. And I do hope to have you, Tunde, Anna, and Carl on the podcast to discuss their work there. Moving on to the announcements made today to coincide with the day's theme, the UK government has launched an urban climate action programme with £27.5 million in funding allocated to at least 15 cities in developing countries across the next 3 years that will be used to decarbonise public transport and energy systems and make waste management more sustainable. It will also fund new climate-smart building codes and climate risk planning, 2 areas where the UK can be a leader. And that's going to be delivered in partnership with the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, so an established framework for delivery there. Other countries have indicated they will also assist with funding of this initiative, so that's likely to grow. Further, the Under 2 Coalition announced today that some 68 cities, regions, and states have signed up now to a range of new cross-sector actions, all to be taken within this decade to decrease emissions, increase climate resilience, protect biodiversity. That coalition, the Under 2 coalition, covers some 260 governments and represents 50% of the economy. They've all updated membership criteria to require a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature pathway. A further 1,049 cities and local governments are participating in the Race to Zero initiative. That's alongside 60% of the UK's FTSE-listed companies. And today, a new 5-year plan was announced, which increases the ambition of the Marrakesh Partnership, which is a partnership between state and non-state actors, so a ratcheting up of ambition there towards a 1.5 degree pathway. And I have to say, that's where most of us draw encouragement and hope. This COP was absolutely different from previous COPs, precisely because of the central involvement of non-state actors here. Now, I'm going to publish a final episode next week, summarising the Glasgow Pact, what it achieved and what remains outstanding. But for now, I really do need to catch up on my sleep. And thank you so much for listening to this and any other podcasts that you might have heard.